Hello there, and welcome to another language professora video. Now, the mere fact that I didn't say hola means that today is an English lesson. And what we have been looking at in particular is the CSEC English A exam. For those of you outside of the Caribbean who don't know what that means, in the Caribbean, that is our high school exit examination. It's done throughout the entire region. And this is one of the topics in terms of the subjects rather, English A or English language. In particular, we have been looking at story writing. This is part 2 of a 4-part series. If you have not yet watched part 1, where we went into some preliminaries in terms of the elements of a story, you can pause this video, go and watch part 1, and then come back for part 2. Now, there are some parts that we did not really look at in detail in part 1. And that was because I knew that when we got to part 2, we were going to be able to fuse them in and get into some more detail. But just a little synopsis of what we did in part 1, just the same, although you still need to go and watch it. We looked at the 4 main elements in terms of the plot of the story, which is what happens in the story. We looked at the fact that the plot has 3 parts to it, which is your conflict, your climax, and your resolution. Your conflict is further broken down into 3 other areas where you have your conflict with yourself, conflict with others, and conflict with nature or the environment. We also had the setting, and with the setting, we spoke about that being divided into 2 areas. Setting encapsulates where the story happens. We discussed that that can be anywhere you choose it to be. We also looked at the setting being when the story happens. And we looked at 3 areas or three divisions of time pretty much, where we looked at your watch time in terms of time of day. We looked at your calendar time, time of year. We looked at your periodical time in terms of an era, centuries, decades, whatever the case may be. We discussed briefly characters, and I'm going to be going into more detail with characters in this video because the characters in what I'm going to do will kind of bring that out. We looked at characters in terms of the fact that you do have your main characters, and your characters can be introduced in terms of you talking about them. They can talk about themselves, or they can do things that bring out their personality. Of course, you'd have your characters being described in terms of what they look like physically and their personality as well. And we looked to a lesser extent at theme. Theme being the overall moral of the story or the meaning of the story or the message that you can take away from the story. And for the purpose of CSEC, the theme, I would maybe say you can just use the topic as your theme. For now, that's not the true meaning of theme in a story, but you could use a topic to kind of guide you, because a topic is basically what you're given to say, write a story about this topic. So you'd want to ensure that you're able to incorporate that stimulus in order to bring your story to life and get a good score for that part of your exam. So let's take a look. Changing page here. Let's take a look at, and I'm going to be very careful to put this out there from the beginning. We're going to be using a fairy tale, right? Fairy tales, I find, are very easy to use when I'm teaching story writing because they encapsulate the elements beautifully. You will see a plot, you will see a clear plot, you will see the clear conflict, the suspense points, the climax, and the resolution. They're all laid out for you nicely and neatly in a fairy tale. So I'm going to be using a fairy tale. I won't call the name of the fairy tale, however, because I don't want there to be any issues in terms of, I shouldn't have said the name of the fairy tale, but based on how I describe the fairy tale, I am going to assume that my viewers would know what the fairy tale is. So let's get right into it. So we're going to be starting. Now, I want to, first of all, introduce the characters to you in terms of telling you who the characters are in the story, right? So we have 2 main characters, and we have 3 minor characters. But our main characters, there's going to be a little girl, and comment below if you know what fairy tale I'm talking about by the time we get through with this lesson. And there's going to be an animal. And then your minor characters, or in the case of if you're watching a movie, your supporting characters are a mother, grandmother. Please forgive my atrocious handwriting as my pen is glitching and I am not sure why. And there is a worker, in the forest. I'm sure by now you know what fairy tale this is. There is a worker in the forest. Then we also have our plot. And we have our setting, all right? So I'm going to change pages and we're going to get straight into this story. So at the beginning of the story, the little girl is sent to her grandmother. So I might end up having to use abbreviations to compensate for this glitching pen. The little girl is being sent to her grandmother. The little girl is given some instructions. She's told not to go through the forest. So I want to have a little bit of a discussion. She's told not to go through the forest. Here is where you begin to dissect your story. If the little girl is given some instructions and she's told, do not go through the forest, and she obeys those instructions, and she takes the long way around on the hot, dusty road, that's pretty much it. But your conflict comes in when she's told not to go through the forest and she disobeys. Because automatically what you're now expecting to see is, aha, something is going to happen. She did something she wasn't supposed to do, and that's human nature. So you right away, you inject that element of interest, because now your readers want to see, okay, she was told not to go through the forest and she did. What's going to happen now? So this is where you have injected your conflict. And look at the conflict here. This is conflict with others. She was told not to go through the forest, but she disobeys. She makes a choice. Remember, we spoke about making a choice in the first part. She has made a choice. Now, if from this point on, she goes through the forest and nothing happens, if memory serves me correctly, she was also told, don't speak to strangers. Don't speak to strangers. So she was given 2 instructions. She disobeyed one of them. Sorry. So now that she's going through the forest, if in writing your story, you have her going through the forest, la, 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 and nothing happens, she gets to her grandmother's quite okay, you would have wasted your conflict. So you injected the conflict and then you didn't have any We used that word when we were looking at our storyline. You didn't have any suspense. And I'm putting suspense up here and bracketing it as a reminder. You didn't have any suspense being added to your conflict. You just had the conflict and everything unfolded quite okay. But you need to know, after you have put your conflict in, you need to now begin to add points of suspense. So, first suspense point, she meets the animal. Right? You must know which fairy tale this is by now, man. You must know. She meets the animal. Again, your readers are going to say, aha, something is going to happen between her and this animal. If all you have happening is she says, good morning, he says, hi, how are you? And they go on their merry way, you would have again wasted your conflict. But she now disobeys the second time. And she speaks to the animal. Second disobedience, second point of conflict. And we now have some suspense coming into the mix, because a little girl like this was so disobedient. Something has got to happen. No, let me pause right here. We are now learning about the little girl. We are now seeing something about her personality. I'm going to change this color. Yes, let's make it a nice purple. And we see that she is disobedient. So right away, without anyone telling us anything, the little girl's actions have told us, the reader, this is a disobedient little girl. Earlier in the story, she was described, if you know the fairy tale, based on the kind of clothes that she wore. So that part of it was fine. But here we're being told about her character. Now, it could have been a case where her mother would have said to her, I know that you don't like to follow rules and instructions. Do not go through the forest. That would have been the mother telling us that she was disobedient, right? It could have been the little girl herself saying, mommy is quite okay. I am going to do what I want to do. Based on what she said, you would have been able to say she's disobedient. In this case, however, mother didn't say anything. She didn't say anything, but based on what she does, we can pick up that she has a disobedient personality or temperament. I'm going to switch pages. This one is a bit full. But let's remember where we are on this page, right? She meets the animal and she speaks to him after being told, don't talk to animals or don't talk to strangers. Let's switch and see. So the next point now, the animal asks for something from the basket. And she tells him no. But look at what is going to happen now. Now that you have engaged your conflict, because you've had her going through the forest, you've had her disobeying by speaking to a stranger. Now that your conflict is engaged, you're now seeing where you're shifting gear, and the onus of the story moves from the little girl to the animal. So now you see where after the little girl moves on, the animal plots to steal the goods. And this, my viewers, is a point of suspense, because now you get into a mode, or you begin to get into a particular place where you, as the omniscient viewer, and this is one of the reasons why we have the omniscient narrator, they see everything, they know everything. No, you are able to say, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, she is still going through the forest and he is planning to sabotage her. He's planning to interfere. Some way, somehow, he's going to interfere. And right then and there, you have suspense being injected into your story. Another point of suspense is the animal gets to grandma's first. And again, you are like, oh my goodness, oh my gosh, what is going to happen here? What is he going to do with grandma? But notice what is happening. You're traveling along. The little girl is still on her way. And you know that at some point in time, their paths are going to collide once more. And so after he gets to grandma first, and that's another point of suspense, the plot thickens and he disguises himself. And you as the reader know, your readers, or rather your readers should be now saying, oh my goodness, he has dressed up as grandma. What is going to happen when the little girl arrives? So right here, you feel the suspense building and building and building and building. But it's not over. It's not over. There's still more suspense to come. So now we have little girl arrives at grandma's. By now, your reader's heart should be pounding, wondering what is going to happen next. Now, let's talk about this point. If upon her arrival, the animal just pounced and said, hi, give me what's in your basket, your story would have come to a premature end. Remember, he dressed up as the grandmother, so you have to make use of that point of suspense. So Elizabeth arrives, and you're saying, oh my gosh, does she know? Does she not know? Does she know? Does she not know? What's going to happen here? What's going to happen there? She does not recognize the animal. She thinks it's her grandmother. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the story can go from this direction. She does not recognize the animal. Now, suppose the animal's objective was to get what's in her basket, right? Suppose at this point, she had simply handed the basket over and gone on her merry way. Your story would have ended prematurely, but you have to amp it up a little bit more, right? So she does not recognize the animal. Then eventually she becomes suspicious and begins to question. And this, my friends, is where you're building to your climax. Building, building, building to the climax. And with each answer that the animal gives, it's more of a build up to the climax. So here we still have suspense when she doesn't recognize him. But now we're building to the climax. Building up to the climax. And then the ultimate climax is little girl recognizes animal. So after all of that, we come to our climax. And let's put the climax in red. And remember, we spoke about climax being, this is a point in the story at which something has got to give. Something has to happen from this point on. So when she recognizes the animal and she screams out and says, hey, you're not my grandmother. You're that animal that I met in the woods. What happens after this? No. Here is a very good point that I want to inject. You usually can tell the climax of the story. And if you think about soap operas and how they always leave you in what is called limbo, they have that open ending technique that they use. They're always leaving you hanging. The climax of your story is the point of the story at which your readers are left hanging. If you should end the story there, they'd be left wondering, so what happened next? So if at the point where she recognizes the animal and he says, well, I'm going to gobble you up. If you ended the story there and the reader has no idea what transpired afterwards, that is your point of climax in the story. So you want to think about it along that line. And then we have the forest worker. I'll call him that. The forest worker rushes in. So remember we spoke about your resolution being the wrapping up in terms of your climax. So between the climax and the resolution, you have all of these other things happening, and that kind of wraps everything up. So the forest worker rushes in, kills animal, rescues girl and grandmother. And that's your resolution right there. This brings your story to an end. Now, what was the purpose of this exercise? The purpose of this exercise, ladies and gentlemen, is just to show you in as simpler format as is possible how easily you can structure a story. It's not difficult to sit in an examination, or maybe I'm saying that because I like to write stories, but I have seen students who turn out pretty good stories. And if you think about the elements of a story in terms of your conflict and ensuring that you have a very strong conflict, you have points that add to the conflict, and then you have your climax and your resolution, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Before I go, I want to just share audibly an example of a story I came across some years ago. I don't remember what the stimulus was. No, it was something around maybe two young men who were making a plan to go and carry out some sort of revenge. And I'm trying to remember the stimulus, but if it wasn't that, it was something similar to that, carrying out some sort of revenge. And I remember when I was reading the story, and I mean, it fell within the range in terms of the 400 to 500 words. And they spoke about the meeting up, the friends meeting up, and they took their weapons and they got into the getaway car and they drove down the street. And when they got to the street, they were rushed by 7 assailants, and they opened fire on the assailants and then jumped into their getaway car and drove off. Now, what was the essence of the story? The essence of the story came in a surprise ending where the next morning, one of the young men who had carried out the attack was pleased when he heard one of his neighbors bawling because his 7 dogs had been killed. And the young man then reflected and said, yes, that's a fitting end for the 7 wretches who killed my cat. And I found that story quite strong in terms of the story elements. It had everything because they were keeping something from you as the reader. And that's one of the other things that you want to think about. You want to keep something away from the reader. Leave them wondering what's going on. Leave them wondering, because maybe you would have thought in that story, oh, they went and they killed someone. But there was always that element that they kept away from the reader. And then it was revealed at the end of the story. Another quick tip before I go is you don't want to write a fantastic story and then end with, oh, and it was all a dream. No, 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 no. Examiners frown on that sort of an ending. So don't make your story be, oh, it was all a dream. Nope, nope, nope. So that ends part 2 of our story writing session. We have 2 more parts that we're going to be looking at. I want to actually take an actual CSEC past paper question, and we're going to plan the story in terms of all the elements that we've discussed and the basic plot outline. So what we did in this video was basically a plot outline, and we were seeing how the characters came into play, the setting and all of those things, although we didn't go into much detail with that, but we're going to do that with the second, sorry, not with the second, with the third part. So we're going to be looking at an actual CSEC story, and we're going to be doing the breakdown in terms of the brainstorming process, deciding who our characters are going to be, what they're going to be like. Note, however, that your plot outline is not your story. That's not what the examiners will be marking. They'll be marking your actual story. So the plot outline is more like the ingredients that you're going to be using to put together your product, whether it's going to be cake, bulla, cupcake, whatever the case may be. But that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. And then in the final video, we're going to be using that same plot outline to physically sit in this forum and write the actual story. I may use my computer to type in that case because it will go a little bit faster than the tablet and the stylus that seems to be glitching. All right, so that's it. There you have it. Story writing, part 2. I do hope that this was helpful and that the tips that have been shared, that you can actually use them and apply them to your exams. And basically, if you're watching and you're not from the Caribbean, you can use these tips just the same to write a story, however long or short a story that you want to write. But that's it for part 2. See you in part 3. Have a good one.